The Russian ruble is down 25% since the beginning of the year. Now that kind of volatility you can expect from a crypto, but certainly not an international currency. Now for whatever reason, I decided to look up if Putin coin was a thing, and it actually exists out there and it's up like 200% since the beginning of the year. But that's totally beside the point. I wanted to make a video today inspired by all the recent events, primarily the fact that Russia is now banned off the international payment system, and the other more significant fact that the Ukrainian government has been asking for donations in crypto. Not US dollars, not rubles, not any other currency, but Ethereum and Bitcoin. Now I think this is really significant and it has some implications for our future. Now to me, all of these events have really highlighted how fragile and centralized our currency system is, and it does make me worry for the fiat US dollar as our world reserve currency. Out of all the 800 fiat currency systems that have existed in the past, most of them last an average of 27 years. Now the fiat US dollar has been around for about 50, so the collapse of the US dollar is clearly long overdue. Now we didn't always have fiat. Prior to this, we had a linked currency system where our money would be used to represent physical gold sitting away in a vault somewhere in a government bank or something like that. And before this, we actually had physical gold coins, but it's obvious why we went away from that. Now this cycle of going from physical gold to a linked currency system to fiat has been happening over and over again over the last 500 years or so. And the main reasoning that we go from physical gold to the linked currency system to fiat is typically for governments to expand their ability to create debt and create more productivity in the economy. Now, unfortunately, this gets to a point where the whole system is just built on debt, and that is exactly what the US dollar is. Hello, my name is Vadim and welcome. Now, before we get into anything, I want to give you a quick little money-making pitch, also known as US government bonds. So stick with me on this one, it'll be quick. Ever since the US broke the link to gold in 1971, it has had full opportunity to print its own money. So we have three main players here. The US Federal Reserve, which is the people who basically print the money. The US Treasury, which then takes this loan from the Federal Reserve and gives this money to the US government, which spends it on whatever it may need. This might be healthcare, this might be importing goods, or say the military. So all this money is just printed out of thin air, or more than likely just being booped through a computer. The US is still borrowing money and it will have to pay it back eventually. So what the US does now is try to go ahead and sell these bonds to other governments, other countries, with the promise that they're going to pay this money back to them with interest and little risk, because after all, it is the US government. But let's backtrack a little bit here. So remember the money that we printed, we gave to the Treasury and the Treasury gave to the US, it's already spent. And now typically this money is spent on something unproductive. So it's spent on stuff that won't produce more money. So let's say we borrowed $1,000, we spent $1,000 and we have a loan that we gave out and we promised to pay back. So now the US needs to produce $1,000 from somewhere. So what options does the US have here? Well, it simply prints more money and pays back the last round of guys who bought their loans. Of course, they're taking out another loan with this money, so the cycle repeats indefinitely. So we can see how the dollar is kind of like a pyramid scheme, simply using debt with more debt to pay off the previous debt.
Throughout the 80s and 90s and most of the last decade, this system brought unprecedented prosperity to most of the world. The problem, of course, is that it's nothing more than a pyramid scheme. For 40 years, money has been virtually free both here and abroad. This has encouraged borrowing on all levels. Citizens have borrowed from companies to buy goods. Companies have borrowed from banks to loan money. Banks have borrowed from citizens and governments to finance the whole mess, and governments have borrowed from anywhere they possibly can. The whole thing worked because of the world's confidence in the U.S. economy and our government's ability to make good on our debts and prop up the world's reserve currency. In a sense, we have borrowed from other countries, allowing them to create cheap money and continue the borrowing bonanza. That's all fine and dandy until someone stops believing in the system, or rather, stops believing in the dollar.
So yeah, the whole dollar is built up on debt that's being paid off by more debt that's being paid off by more debt. And this is obviously an issue. But of course, this is nothing new. Currencies come and go more frequently than you think. While in our time, the US dollar seems like it's the only thing that has ever existed and it's the only thing that will keep on existing, that's not really the case, and it's a little bit biased. Over the last 500 years or so, we have had 3 different major world reserve currencies. The Spanish real was dominant for centuries before following a steep decline in the 1800s. Then came the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and eventually after World War II, the US rose as a superpower and established itself as the next world reserve currency. The point is, all major world currencies or superpowers rise and fall in a way that looks something like this. So as a new world order is established, whether it be the US or the Dutch guilder, we enter a period of prosperity where debt is used productively to create more goods, more services, to export more goods out of the country, etc. So at this point in time, the monetary system that we have in place probably sits somewhere between hard money like physical gold and linked paper money. As we shift towards the top of the chart where we begin to create a debt bubble and a wealth gap, we are certainly in a system of fiat currency, which gives governments the full ability to maximize debt or credit. You can quite easily imagine that we are somewhere on this debt bubble phase transitioning to a bubble burst. It's a little bit unfortunate that we couldn't be on the opposite end of this chart, but here we are. So following this, we have a serious recession, more money printing, which creates more instability, more wealth gaps, and some restructuring, which leads to a new system that can be implemented because people have lost faith in governments and the system in place. Following the fall, a new empire or a new system rises to power, hopefully introducing changes for the better, leading to an evolutionary process over time that gets better and better and better. Now, when this instability happens and the restructuring is happening, people typically run back to something like gold, which is a real physical asset, and it's not something that's built up on completely fake value like the dollar. So as we're currently in a fiat system and we're sitting at tippy top of this chart somewhere, is it possible that we go back to something physical like gold as the world begins to lose its stability? Now maybe it is, but I feel like this is where something like Bitcoin steps in and leads us into that new world order, that new revolutionary change. Let's just briefly compare Bitcoin to some of the other previous systems that we talked about, like physical gold, the linked currency system, and fiat. You'll quickly notice that Bitcoin is basically a hybrid version of gold and fiat, which takes both of its best elements. Let's have a look at this chart. So if we just look at the traits of money like fungible, not consumable, portability, blah, 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 we see that gold has a few issues with being easily transactable. It's not necessarily decentralized. We can't necessarily divide it up into lots of little pieces. Well, we can, but it's a little bit awkward. You have to melt it down. It's, very back in the day. Now, the issue with the dollar is more so related to the supply. It's not a predictable supply. We can't predict it because it's typically controlled by the government. Once again, it's not decentralized. Just look at how easily the whole world said to Russia, we're going to ban all of your bank accounts. You cannot take anything. And while it is the right move, it just shows you how much power people have over our currency system. And when we move over to crypto here, we can see that the only issue here, which isn't an issue for me, is that it isn't government issued. The actual Bitcoins aren't provided by the government. Everything else seems to tick all the boxes, and that's why I think the next step in our financial system, which might be the next little revolution, is Bitcoin being introduced as the primary transacting currency all over the world. Now, what makes me really worried though is the introduction of CBDCs. Now that is quite a mouthful. It's central bank digital currencies. It's essentially the same thing as the US dollar or the euro or whatever, just crypto edition, so dollar 2.0. It's handed out by the government, so in a way, it's even worse in terms of becoming even more centralized and tracking everybody's transactions, everybody's moves, because now it's completely digital and handed out by the government as well, so the supply isn't necessarily going to be limited. The whole world financial system has me worried, the US dollar has me worried, the CBDCs have me worried, and the only recommendation that I have, as soon as I watched that long documentary that I mentioned earlier, my first instinct was to go ahead and buy a brick of gold. And now obviously I didn't do that because I'm not that rich, but yeah, I guess the point is to have physical assets, low risk, that aren't necessarily reliant upon any particular country, anything that's centralized, you should avoid, in my opinion. That's all I have for this video. Let me know what you think the future is about our financial transacting system. Leave a comment. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.